everybody. Welcome on in. Happy Wednesday. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to everybody that happens to be here in the chat waiting for now. Thanks for being here. And welcome to Book Passage Live. My name is Nick, and I'd like to welcome you to another one of our author talks, or speaker and writer talks in this case. We here at the bookstore are very excited to bring to you some of the best authors and conversations that you can find out there on the internet. If you've been to one of these events before, well then, welcome back. If you're new here, then Book Passage is an independently run bookstore out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and back when crowds weren't quite so dangerous to be in, we hosted book talks just like these in our bookstore. As we are now streaming on YouTube, and I think we'll continue to do so in the future, please consider subscribing by clicking the subscribe button just below the video. It doesn't cost you anything, and honestly, truthfully does help us out. If you click the little bell next to the subscribe button, you'll be alerted every time we go live and every time we post some killer book content. If you'd like to check out our upcoming events, you can find them all at bookpassage.com/event. There's no S at the end of that word, just event. If you'd like to check out tonight's book, Remember Who You Are, or anything else that gets mentioned here tonight, you can also find it all at Book Passage or in the description below the video, or from me spamming it in the YouTube chat periodically. Finally, if you have any questions for tonight's speakers, please take the time to write them in the YouTube chat, and I will make sure to relay them to whoever is the appropriate person to ask the question or to. We don't always get to every single one of them, but just so you know, all of the questions and comments are always appreciated. I've never met a speaker that doesn't like answer questions from all of you. So if you have them, please do write them in the chat. And now, Steve Kettmann, who is the editor of our book today, Remember Who You Are, has reported for more than 20 countries on 5 continents for publications including the New York Times, the New Republic, Village Voice, GQ, Salon.com. He was a San Francisco Chronicle sports writer for nearly a decade. He conceived and edited Game Time, Roger Angel's collection of baseball writing. We are joined tonight by Brian Murphy and Shelley M. Smith, and hopefully we will be joined by Ken Rosenthal, who is currently trapped aboard an airplane, but hopefully he'll join up whenever he can. When that happens, I'll just interrupt the show and we'll get things set up really quickly and then jump right back in. Everybody, thank you so much for coming out tonight. Let me get out of the way and hand the show back over to our speakers so we can get some baseball magic rolling. Thank you. Welcome, speakers. Hello, hello, hello.
Thank you, Nick, and it's great to be here. Thank you to Book Passage. We have bittersweet feelings, obviously, about talking about this book, about our friend Pedro Gomez, who died suddenly in February of sudden cardiac arrest the day of the Super Bowl. And plenty of us are still reeling from that loss. But there is something something beautiful in bringing our voices together, 62 strong, 62 personal essays in the book, which was published as of yesterday. Remember Who You Are, what Pedro Gomez showed us about baseball and life. And I want to offer apologies from Ken Rosenthal, who some of you may have watched during the All-Star Game coverage. He was flying home from Colorado, and I've been in this situation. You're on the plane, you're ready to get off, and then they say, all of a sudden they close the doors again, say a lightning warning means you can't get off the plane. Shelley and Murph, you've both been in that situation, haven't you? I definitely have. Yeah. So he was stuck on the plane. He is trying to get available to come on, and we think he'll join us in a few minutes. And so for now, we are very happy to be joined by Brian Murphy of KNBR, former sports writer as well. Some may not remember Murph, the writer, but even with his books, he's a great writer. I always thought so. Pedro thought so. And Shelley Smith, who is also a former San Francisco sports writer. Now, as with Pedro, moved on to ESPN fame. And Shelley, that horrible day in February, you had to go on the air and do a beautiful report about Pedro, which I put it over in the chat area, but the website for the book is thegomezrules.com. And if you look there, you can follow the tabs at the top, and find Shelley's, the video of Shelley's report from that day. So we'll start by having each of us read just a little bit about the book. You know, we as a nation and all of us as individuals over the last year or two, there was so much loss. I mean, there was so much loss through COVID. There was death and sickness and people dying where so many people had the experience of not even being able to go into the ICU to meet with a loved one, and having these deaths feel ripped loose from any kind of context. There, you know, was no time to catch up. And so part of what the book is meant to be, it's not that we think every individual deserves a 440-page hardcover that's, you know, big enough. It's pretty heavy in the hand. Or Pedro, you know, to us, he was very special. The point isn't to turn him into anything he wasn't. It's to celebrate what he meant to us and to look to the values that he embodied and the way he was able to touch so many lives. So I'll actually start by reading a little bit from my introduction to the book. Pedro and I were both lucky to have many incredible mentors over the years, including Edvinds Badix of the San Francisco Examiner, a man only Ray Ratto has the flair and fury to summon fully. Ray, in his essay in the book, calls Badix a, quote, keenly insightful bag of rumpled laundry and a weird oracle, quote unquote. All true. I knew Pedro was a natural as a mentor to countless young journalists and knew some of the stories, but only after we'd lost him did I begin to get a sense of the staggering scale of just how many lives he'd influenced in huge ways. Serena Morales writes in her essay of idolizing Pedro before they'd ever met, and of him helping her in her career all the way to anchoring SportsCenter. Alden Gonzalez's essay title says it all. He carved a path for me. Pedro's death jolted baseball the way it did, I think, because in his death, we all saw 1,000 other deaths. Our own, of course, for if a man so full of life and love could drop dead just like that, then of course, all of us can. But also the death of dreams, the death of those careening and gleeful enthusiasms of youth, the vertiginous feel of unlimited possibility, which baseball can and should evoke, at least in the heart of a true fan. Baseball knew that if you let it, Pedro knew that if you let it, baseball could take you places, instill in you wonder and joy, and most of all, an unforgettable sense of connection with others. He asked only that you be open to the moment, open-eyed and open-hearted, which was why his face twisted into a sucking on lemons scowl when he talked about dead fish, people who were only going through the motions. He really doesn't care about baseball. Pedro told me in the final weeks of his life about one executive, a pronouncement that made Pedro deeply sad, like Obi-Wan wincing when he felt a weakening of the force. I think the outpouring after Pedro's death had to do with more than just charm, more than just likability. Pedro truly did stand for something. He believed that baseball and other sports offered us a chance to be a little more human, a little more passionate, a little more tuned into the spice and variety and sheer crazy wonder of life's randomness. He believed baseball and other sports could bring people together because he lived that himself for decades. He loved that feeling of standing on the field during a World Series, there at the center of the action, as wired into what was happening as anyone could be. Thank you. That's from the intro. Then it would be great if Brian and Shelley could also start off by reading a little bit from their excellent essays in the book. Murph, are you ready to get us started?
Ladies first, Shelley.
Ladies first, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, Shelley was at the Examiner before I was, so, and Shelley was working with him that day. So
mine's really sad though.
Well, it's
Really
okay.
sad.
We're all sad. It's like as Steve said, it's bittersweet. The whole experience is bittersweet. So
All right. Well, if yours is happier, you should go first.
yeah, we'll end on a happier note.
Yes.
How's that?
Before I start, Pedro was as charming and affable as anybody I've ever known in this business. He was a friend to all of us, and he didn't care what you were, who you were, what you did, who you did. He was always trying to help, and he has showed that a million different times. So, all right, here we go, and I'll try to get through this without breaking up.
It's okay.
The last time I heard from Pedro was the afternoon he died. Our boss wanted to know if Pedro and I could handle the news the next 2 days for SportsCenter. Pedro's text, of course. He said that a lot, never wanting to turn down an assignment if he could help it. Writing Pedro's obituary for ESPN and then voicing it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. It took me at least 3 tries to get the first sentence out through the microphone. And I've written and voiced dozens of obits. I wrote my mother's in 2018 and my sister's in 2016, but I didn't have to voice them. They were for various newspapers. I think the sound of my voice reading the words about Pedro scared me in an emotional way I'd never felt before. As I said then and will say now, he was our colleague. He was our friend.
Thank you, Shelley.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Shelley. And none of us had to do what you had to do, which is to put voice to it that day. We all watched it, and you did a beautiful job. And as Steve says, anybody can watch it on the website. Hey, Ken.
Hi, Ken.
Hey.
Hey,
Ken.
everybody, how's it going?
We need a little levity.
Yeah, we do. Well, good, great to see you. So we'll let you get settled. We're sitting around here reading. Steve, by the way, that was incredibly beautiful. I always tell Steve every time we've talked after this book that, like, I'm proud that I have an essay, and Shelley's proud, and Ken's proud. But really, after Steve's intro, none of us had to write.
I totally agree.
I mean, Steve, you.
What you did was so amazing. I don't know many friends who would do that for a fallen friend. I really don't.
I mean,
I agree.
We've all lost friends, and we all have felt deeply. None of us put together a book like this. So, Steve, you are. I mean, listen, I know you're not here for the Strokes, and you didn't do it for the Strokes, but it does need to be acknowledged that a human being did something extraordinary for another human being, and inspiring, Steve, inspiring for all of us going forward in our lives, really. So, you know, where here I am just vamping because I do this for a living, but you know what it reminds me of, and Shelley, you know this, is Dwight Clark, and how people rallied. I was close to that whole scene, contributed to a book that we did for him that Matt Mayoko did, Letters for 87. And I was so touched by how the 49ers rallied. What friends did for Dwight was so inspirational. And now, Steve, you're providing even more inspiration. So.
Well, that's great that you mentioned that, because, you know, Brad Mangian, good friend of many of ours, great photographer, you know, reached out and wanted to be involved in this project because he loved Pedro and they had done a book. He also worked on the Dwight project. And in some ways we used it as a kind of template where, you know, I've written books that were New York Times bestsellers. I've written books that a few people read, but they were important to them. But you know what? None of that stuff matters with this project. It's just about a beautiful book that's full of emotion and full of beautiful pictures. And, you know, Brad Mangian did an incredible job with this. And it was a spirit where so many people were so generous. Kenny, when I first talked to him about the project, all 3 of you, just not only were you in immediately, but it was just low maintenance. What can I do? What do you need? And without that, we could never have done a project like this. So I'm just so thankful to all you.
Just by way of your example here, this is what Brad does through pictures. We tried to do through words, but Brad insisted that we do these end papers. Look at Pedro and his family on their European vacation. And then the other end paper, this was opening day in San Francisco, and you can't see it maybe, but Pedro's on the scoreboard there. It was the tribute to Pedro on the scoreboard on opening day. So Pictures go a long way too, obviously, and Brad did amazing. I'll read my little excerpt, and then Kenny, you can bat cleanup here. Mine, it's funny, Steve, I'm glad you read what you read, because in your excerpt, you said, Pedro just asked you to be open to the moment and be willing to experience, the ride that baseball can give you and that life can give you. So what's funny is everybody wrote a different essay, and a lot of people just ruminated. Some people meditated. Some people commented and told stories. Jack Curry told stories about music in him, and Howard Bryant thought about mortality and all that. But mine was to what you said, which was a ride with Pedro. If you're willing to go on a ride with Pedro, what can happen, And so it was my lucky week in New York doing the Red Sox Yankees 1999 ALCS. I was the A's beat writer in 1999, and Pedro just befriended me because I was part of the, quote, A's family now. And as a result, I'll read it. Here, I'll just read you a page, okay? The A's did not make the playoffs in 1999, but my sports editor at the San Francisco Examiner, Glenn Schwartz, Shelley, you know him.
He was mine too.
Yeah.
Legend.
He was a ball guy. Budget be damned. He was sending his A's and Giants beat writers to cover the league championship series. In 1999, that meant John Shea drew Braves Mets. It meant I drew Red Sox Yankees. It meant I drew my new best ball writer friend, Pedro Gomez, in baseball's best city, in baseball's most hallowed stadium, in baseball's greatest month. I can still hear Pedro, my Irish amigo, let's go to Yankee Stadium. I'll meet you in the Grand Hyatt lobby. Okay. I can still see Pedro in his coat and tie, laptop satchel over his shoulder, bright white teeth smiling under those eyebrows, waiting for me in the lobby. His smile was for Yankees Red Sox. His smile was for October. His smile was for the excitement of showing his rookie ball writer pal the way to do it, the Pedro way. So the Pedro way was the number 4 subway, of course. The Pedro way was to feel the pregame energy through the jostling crowds of Yankee fans in O'Neill t-shirts and El Duque jerseys, crammed together in the train and spilling out into the Bronx, where we smelled the sausages and onions from street vendors, and felt the chill of the night air and saw the brightness of the stadium lights against a dark Gotham sky. The Red Sox and Yankees in October strained credulity. We drew the 2 most storied teams in the game. I had a sensei like Pedro to show me the way in, to take me to the packed press room downstairs, and to make sure all the New York writers and broadcasters, George King, Joel Sherman, Tyler Kepner, Michael Kay, Susan Waldman, on and on, knew that the new kid from the San Francisco Examiner was okay. Pre- and post-game press conferences are run by the American League and their venerable and respected director of public relations, Phyllis Marriage. Phyllis was like the White House press secretary, only more important because it was the stadium in October. Phyllis, whatever you do, don't take any questions from Murphy from the San Francisco Examiner. Pedro needled, eyes glinting. This Mick is trouble. Stay away, Phyllis. That was all Phyllis needed to hear. She winked and made sure to call on me. Game 1 was everything. Extra innings, Bob Shepard on the PA, Eddie Layton on the organ, a controversial blown call against the Red Sox, a walk-off home run by Bernie Williams, Frank Sinatra, Frank Sinatra, Frank Sinatra. I figured the press conferences with Yankee manager Joe Torre and Red Sox manager Jimmy Williams would do the trick for quotes, not knowing clubhouse access in October. Pedro wanted more. Make sure you get Rod back after the game, Pedro urged. Speaking of the ex-Giant who surrendered Williams' blast. He'll be in the clubhouse for sure. Squeeze in there. Old Shooter Beck was a stand-up guy, sure enough. I can still feel the crush of bodies around his locker, can still see the beer in his hand, still hear his disappointed yet patient voice explaining the one that got away. That advice made my story. An adrenalized write for sure. Heady stuff. Filed to the Examiner around 1 a.m. Eastern. Ready to go? Pedro asked, a few laptops over. Where to? I asked, still dazed from the drama, the lights, the scene. Dude, come on. It's New York in October. And off we went.
Oh, yeah.
That's awesome, Brian.
Excellent.
Awesome. Awesome.
I think
Yeah.
you might have to read that whole thing again a second time. I might just need to
The
hear
whole
that.
book.
Well,
You
I
did a
told
great
Steve
voice.
when he asked me to read it, I started reading it, and I just wanted to be back in that time with him,
Mhm.
you know? So we're just
That's
gotta be
great.
thankful we had it, right?
It was
Yep.
really great.
But anyway, Kenny?
Ken, are you queued up with an excerpt to read, or do you need a minute to think about
I
that?
am. I'm actually ready to go.
Awesome.
Of course you are.
Steve knows this. I wasn't a guy who worked with Pedro ever. I didn't even travel with him or work with him at ESPN or anywhere else, but we kind of evolved into the same kind of job. And we came up together at the same time. So we always kind of knew each other. And my relationship with him is different than others simply because there wasn't that pure closeness, but it was almost like a kinship. So this is me writing about kind of how he was the model for what we do. What Pedro knew almost instinctively is something I slowly came to understand, that the best part of being a baseball reporter, the relationships you form with all sorts of different people, is the defining element of the job as well. All news reporting requires an ability to relate to people, but on most beats, the contacts are not as varied as they are in baseball. There are players, coaches, managers, owners, general managers, and agents, scouts, umpires, club employees, people young and old, male and increasingly female, North American, Latin American, Asian. No baseball reporter can do the job well without finding a way to connect with people from all of these groups. But Pedro's essence, his natural inquisitiveness, his radiant warmth, his intense desire to share in the human experience, that was his secret. That was his separator from the rest of us. Now, AJ Hinch, former Astros manager, Diamondbacks manager, he got to know Pedro when he was hired in Arizona to manage the Diamondbacks in 2009. He tells a story about when the Astros signed infielder Yuli Gurriel out of Cuba in July 2016. Now, Pedro, of course, had a particular affinity for Cuban baseball. His parents had fled Cuba from Miami in 1962, and he knew that Gurriel's father, Lourdes Sr., was one of the all-time best players from Cuba. Pedro quickly determined that Hinch, as a member of Team USA, had played against the elder Gurriel in the 1993 Intercontinental Cup, the 1994 Baseball World Cup. Now, nobody else is even looking at this. Well, he couldn't wait to tell Hinch that the Astros signing of Yuli meant that he would now get to manage Lourdes' son. And here's what AJ Hinch said. I feel like he always covered the sport as people first and content second. He had a way of understanding you in a depth that few other media members ever attempt, let alone master. And that's it. That to me was Pedro. He connected with people in a way that most of us dream of. And for one of the many reasons we love him so much.
It's beautiful.
Ken, you're just back from the All-Star game. I think it'd be cool for all of us to talk a little bit about what Pedro did. And I think it was 2013 after the home run derby won by Yoenis Cespedes, when Pedro stepped out there to interview him for ESPN Live and in real time translated that moment. Now, I've interviewed a lot of people in a lot of difficult settings, but I've never had to do anything like that. But can you, Ken, and you, Shelley, talk about how hard that was to do and how amazing it was what he pulled off there?
Yes, and it was cool to see ESPN honor Pedro during the home run derby the other night. They had a little segment about him, and it was perfectly done because that was one of the moments where he shined most. Now, there are very, very few of us who are bilingual, and it's kind of the biggest regret of my career that I did not learn Spanish and master it to communicate with players. It's terrible that I'm not there with that. It was one of his magic tricks, and it wasn't such magic. He just learned the language. He knew the language. And to do that on live TV, Marley Rivera does it now too, and she does it very well as well. But it showed just so much of him. One, his ability to master two languages. Two, his ability to communicate both of them on television, which is not hard to do in one language, which is hard to do in one language. And then just his feel for the game and his feel for the people. And the home run derby, frankly, is not the same without him. And I know Marley, I love Marley, and she does a great job. But was kind of Pedro's event, one of his many events. I mean, he did World Series, of course, and all that kind of thing. But the home run derby, because of that element, often we have Latin players in, almost always, Pedro could shine.
I so agree, Ken. He was a master at it, and it's not easy. I tried to learn Spanish, I tried to learn Japanese, and I kept getting them confused. So that makes no sense whatsoever, but it's a really difficult skill. I don't know that I want to go into this, but Stephen A., what he said about Shohei Ohtani, he doesn't understand how difficult it is to go on TV and speak a different language and feel comfortable speaking a different language. But Pedro did. And it's a very, very difficult skill. I mean, I can say Ohayo gozaimasu and buenas noches, but that's about it. But to be able to carry on a conversation, an interview on television is very, very difficult. You just can't do it. You just can't study the language for 2 years. Well, some people can. And then go on TV and make sense. So I don't really want to go into it, but Shohei Ohtani is a hero in my book because he's Japanese and he's learned a little bit of English. He just doesn't feel comfortable going on television, nor would I. Barely in English.
And you guys and Shelley and Ken, you can both speak to this. You came up as writers. It's two different skill sets. Pedro, just you mentioning that, Steve, I think of the joy that he had when he was doing that Cespedes thing, or any of them with David Ortiz or whoever.
Oh, he was so good.
He exuded the joy. I mean, you Ken and Shelley, you guys can speak. It's not that easy to be on camera. You guys have had to learn for many years how to.
Still learning. Yeah.
I'm not even comfortable on the Zoom camera right now. You know what I mean? So, but I mean, Steve, he was a writer. How does he do that on TV then, because of his essence? Who was it? One of you said his essence.
He was so warm and friendly and welcoming, and people loved him.
Well, Shelley, to your point about what he did there as well, the pride has to be talked about. I mean, I was on the road with Pedro for years. We spent a lot of time together. It was a luxury. And I, at one point, almost did a book with the Roberto Clemente family. I went down to San Juan, met with Vera and the family, and books are weird, it was a great project, didn't pan out. But Pedro was incredibly excited about it. He wanted to know everything about it because Clemente, he had such incredible respect for Clemente as a ball player, but then also as a man. And we know the story of him dying on the shipment, the DC-3 on its way to help the victims of the earthquake in Nicaragua on New Year's Day. But Pedro felt such incredible pride in all great players like Roberto Clemente, who at the time received very, very little respect and little understanding from contemporary journalists. So for Pedro, with that Cespedes interview, to mark some kind of sea change, I think, in how Latin players in the game are covered and the extent to which we try to understand them as individuals, as humans. We have an essay in the book from a younger writer, Alden Gonzalez, who talks about watching that moment, the Cespedes, and it was like, it was incredible to him, and it forged a path for him into journalism. And so I know that Pedro made it look easy, something that was very hard, but he also brought so much pride. And that was one reason why the title of the book is Remember Who You Are, because Pedro never forgot who he was.
And you know what, even today, last night, Vladimir Guerrero, MVP of the All-Star game, and it's killing me that we can't do him justice because he's not comfortable in English. And yes, we do the post-game ceremony and there's an interpreter and it comes off fine, but Vlad's personality, he has an unbelievably buoyant personality. It's not going to come through in that way. Now, Pedro, because of his bilingual ability, could pull that off, and he could do it with Cespedes, could do it with any of these players. And I feel also, I know this, he had in his mind a responsibility to do that. He felt that was an important part of who he was and how to bring these players to the public. And it is so important. So we don't have ignorant statements like the one that happened the other day. People have to understand just what Shelley was saying. It's incredibly difficult And painful for some of these guys to try to communicate in a second language, and they don't want to be embarrassed. You can understand that. It would be the same for any of us in any other country. But
Exactly.
Pedro on camera, I want to get back to this because Brian mentioned it about Shelley and I coming from the written world, and we're still in the written world, of course, but it was not easy for me, that transition. In fact, there were a lot of rocky roads. And I didn't understand that a television person, you just couldn't talk like this and give your information. You had to have some personality. And I said this in the essay, it took Fox putting me in a bow tie to kind of distinguish me.
Love the bow tie.
Well, thanks, but it was not an easy thing, the first part of it. And they said, listen, we want you to be this person. You are this person, let's go. And they kind of had to drag me kicking and screaming into that world.
Wow.
Pedro, hey, here I am, let's go.
Put him in a clown's hat. Yeah, it'd be fine.
I envied that. It was a great quality. And the person on TV was the person you see, or we would hang out with. That's, you know, Brian went drinking with that night, and Steve palled around with for all those years on the road that Shelley knew. And that was the beauty of him.
Yeah, and so your point about the Cespedes moment, and here we are, we're all American, right? And we all had this connection with Pedro, and we all joked about this. And Ken, you said this, and Mark Kreidler said this on our show, is that one of the humbling things about this book was finding out that so many people had the same relationship with Pedro that you thought you had, you know? It's like, wait a minute, he had that relationship and she had that relationship. I thought that was my relationship with Pedro. He was amazing that way. He was like, I said to you at the event the other night, Steve, I felt like he was almost, now that we reflect on him, he was almost sent by angels to sort of teach us how to live. Like he graced us all and then he left, you know, too early. But the point about that I just wanted to make is that the Cespedes interview, that the same connection he made with us as Americans in our culture, in our English, he makes with Cespedes on live TV. Like his essence is bilingual. You know what I mean? His essence goes through any cultural barrier. Like he made Cespedes feel comfortable and happy the way he made all of us feel comfortable and happy. So it didn't matter what language it was.
At our bureau meetings that we used to have, that he rarely attended because it was during the All-Star game and the ESPYs. But when he did, we used to fight over who got to sit next to him. We really did, because he was so charming and so handsome. And we all like, no, I'm sitting next to Pedro. No, I'm sitting next to Pedro. But he was that way to everybody, not just us.
Well, yeah, somebody said that too, but like he treated everybody that way.
Yes.
It wasn't.
And that's true in the baseball ecosystem. I wrote this too in my passage or in my essay, how he could be getting ready to go on camera, and some clubhouse attendant that he knew from his early days with the A's could walk by. Pedro grabs the guy, says hello, and hey, we are on ESPN. It's just amazing to me that he could do that. But the point of that is he never was too big for anybody. Yeah. And Shelley, you know this very well in our business. There are a lot of people who are too big for people, and you see it all the time. And when you don't see that, we won't name names.
I don't name names. When you
see it the other way, it's completely refreshing and almost inspiring, honestly.
Yeah, inspiring. We continue to be inspired by him in so many different ways. And you mentioned it, Steve, too. It wasn't just the baseball, looking out for young writers. I mean, I mentioned in my book, I started as a prep writer, like most of us, and then eventually got my first pro beat was the 49ers. And then my big jump to San Francisco was the Oakland A's. And I just, all of a sudden, he came up to me and he's like, talking to me like we were lifelong friends. And I said, what, I knew Pedro, but we hadn't hung out. And he said, well, you're part of the A's family now. And so the point is looking out for young writers. And Steve, you did a great job of getting such a wide variety of voices in this thing, including young writers that even in 2021 were touched by him.
And including Rio Gomez and Dante Gomez. When Shelley and I talked about the book, she was one of the first to flag for me that how special that Rio Gomez essay is. I mean, I was in sensitive talks with the Boston Globe sports editor and ESPN because they both wanted to print it this week, which they both did. And I saw at the Globe site, for example, there was a tremendous comments at the end. But this is just a beautiful story that transcends sports. Rio Gomez is, he's a left-handed pitcher, hits about 92, 93. Changeup is more his pitch, but a very smart player who gets everything out of his ability. And he's pitching he's in the Boston Red Sox organization, AA right now. And when he was in high school in Ahwatukee, he was cut from his high school team, his varsity team. He got in his car, he drove home, he sat out in front of the house. He couldn't go in. He didn't call or text his parents to say what had happened. He was just sitting in the car crying. And what did Pedro do? Somehow he's there. Rio doesn't even know, how he knew, but he was just there, opens the door, gets in without saying a word. And all of us know Pedro, and anyone watching who was very well aware, Pedro wasn't a guy who did that much with silence. That wasn't really his thing. Right. But in this particular context, he stayed silent. I mean, Rio says he, writes in the essay that he stayed silent for an hour, might be an exaggeration, but he listened to his son. He heard him out. He was there for him. And I'm a dad. I have 2 small children, but that essay, I could read it 20 times and it would still get to me. I think it's so beautiful.
It's so
I read that too. And my reaction to that was, you know what? Not only was he better than me professionally, much better dad. That was really inspiring. That was a really, I don't know, I can't even describe it, but what he did there, and I encourage people to read it because you have to get it from the print words of Rio himself. But what Pedro did there was really the perfect father moment, the perfect way to handle it. And really, there are not a lot of people, I would conclude myself, who might not have handled it quite like that. And what happened, of course, Rio's career went on from there. He had some bumps in the road even after that. But man, Pedro was there for him in the right way, not the overbearing little league father, but the support system that a guy like that needs.
And just here's a quick anecdote. Beautifully said, Ken. You're right. He's inspiring us even to be better parents is what he is. And you're absolutely right. I took the same thing from that you did as a dad at young kids. So here's another story. So it was 2 years ago. So all our kids now have to play travel baseball, right? Why we do this, I don't know, but we do. It's the fear of missing out or keeping up with the Joneses or the hamster wheel. I don't know what it is. Get them off video games. Maybe that's one thing. So we're at one of those, you look back at the time, it's a big deal. Your 11-year-old son is in a travel ball tournament, right? In some place that has to be like an hour and 45 from your house, right? It's never 5 minutes from your house. It's always an hour and 40. It's like, it's not too far that you can't go, but it's so far that it's like a pain in the ass to get there, right? So it's like, so I'm down there and my phone rings. It's Pedro. So he's calling. He'll call whatever. He'll call for whatever. As you can see in the book, he'll call anybody, anytime, anywhere, just to drop you a little nugget, And he called me to tell me a funny story about Steve Carsey, because there's a funny longer story that if we had more time, I'd tell about Carsey at the Grotto in Scottsdale. And he had a funny story about Carsey, and he goes, and he heard the sounds in the background. He goes, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm at a travel ball tournament for my 11-year-old son." And he goes, and he just immediately, though, he switched friends. He goes, Murph, please don't put pressure on him, please.
Aww.
And it was like this, the tone changed into this really soft, meaningful words. And he just knew the right thing. He just knew that people were charged up. People were stressing over their kids at bat or their inning on the mound, or whether they were getting enough playing time or whatever. And I'll never forget the way, because we were laughing as usual. We were always laughing. And then the way he just changed his tone of voice. And he didn't say it in a preachy way at all. He said it in a loving way. And he was right. He was 100% right. He said, just please let him play. Don't put pressure on him, Murph. Enjoy it. These are special days. And I was like, wow. I was looking around at all the dads who were aggroed out, and I was like, they should be on the phone with Pedro right now,
Or all the soccer moms that I had to grow up with.
There you go.
And
we needed to get a call from Pedro.
Yeah.
Rio got cut from his senior year. Rio got cut from his varsity team his senior year. He's now pitching for the Boston Red Sox minor league AA.
Amazing.
He's still with the AA team now?
Yes.
He is, yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about Pedro and Rio that I think is also cool is, let's be clear, Pedro, as Pedro would put it, he had that in his game to be a little tough on Rio because he cared so much. And so he worked with it. And what he did was, and I think you all know this, but he was incredibly resourceful about reaching out to people. So rather than always be telling Rio what he should do, he would just use his reporting contacts as a resource. And so There's the story of Greg Maddox, which we didn't use in full in the book, but talking about how to find the perfect grip for your changeup, and but
you didn't use Greg Maddox on that?
Hey.
He was reporting the story, right? He's reporting the story.
Yep.
So make the extra call, right?
So many times. Barry Zito, he'd just get someone and put Rio on the phone, and they would explain some little tiny point of, or they would explain to Pedro, and then he would pass it on to Rio. But the point was, it wasn't like your dad's telling you this. It was bringing in a really cool source of information, and you could learn something.
Yeah, that would work.
Yeah.
That would be like Mia Hamm on the phone with my daughter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you can still do that. Give her a call.
Well, she's 35 now. Her time is different.
Oh, man.
You guys have been great. You guys are terrific. And it's so much fun to talk about Pedro like this.
Well, as I told Steve, the book is the book. And first of all, if whoever's watching this, please get it, because as Ken mentioned about there's lessons everywhere, including people and parenting, but I'm not going to lie, it's a bittersweet to read it.
It is. It's tough. It's a little tough.
You miss them. You miss them.
But I will say, the collection of people that Steve collected essays from, it's amazing. It's an amazing group of people, unbelievably accomplished in so many different ways. And I've said this on Twitter when I promoted the book, to say I was honored to be a part of it, that's not even the right word. No. It's just a really special thing. And Murph, I think we were talking about this on your show the other day, but that book, the way I read it, it's a celebration of life. And Pedro was life. I mean, that guy was like just vibrant. It was pouring out of him. And that's the guy I'm going to remember. That's the guy I'm going to talk about and tell younger writers about, because it was so unique and so cool. And it was such a privilege for all of us to know him, that to see him remembered this way because of the great work Steve did putting this together.
Amazing. And
there's no better tribute.
Fast.
Guys, don't you think that, I mean, there's 62 of us and we were lucky to get the tap, but there are 100, if you wanted to do 162, because 162.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was really an amazing tribute to Pedro, that when I did reach out to people, we're talking really accomplished writers, really accomplished people, and that who we're used to hearing from. We kind of know what to expect from a lot of these writers, but they found ways to stretch themselves because they were inspired. I mean, all of you, and so many others, I think, did some of the best writing that I've ever seen from these people, just because they're such beautiful, powerful human stories. Wanted to tell people out there listening that we have a few minutes left, and there is a chat bar on the right at YouTube. If you do want to type in any questions for Brian or Shelley or Ken, we'd be happy to answer those. And also let anyone in the Bay Area know that this Saturday we will be having an event for the book. Murph, are you coming? I can't remember if we've got you down or not.
I mean, you know where I'm going to be? In frickin' St. Louis.
Oh, that's right. Of course. I knew that. Yes, I knew that. Yeah.
And our beat writer, Giants beat writer, Kerry Crowley, one of the young studs on the rise, said, bottom 3 road city. Would you agree?
St. Louis?
Well, I hope there aren't
It's
people.
not bottom 3
for this right now.
Oh, I think St. Louis is great.
All right. We could have listeners. We could have book buyers from St. Louis. So I don't want to.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was a funny line, though, from a young kid on the road. He's in his 20s. He's looking for charges.
Well, for him, it might be a bottom 3.
Yeah, for him. But anyway, no, it's KNBR is doing a listener trip and we're going with listeners to the Giants Cardinals series. So I'm going to miss it, Steve. So.
Well, we'll tune into you there. But for people who are here, we'll have several of the contributors. We will have Sandy Gomez, Pedro's wife, Dante Gomez, who also has an excellent essay in the book, and Brad Mangin, Robin Carr, Steve Fainaru, his brother, Mark Fainaru-Wada, who's not even in the book, but an excellent writer and reporter. and several others. So that's at 858 Amigo Road in Soquel, the Wellstone Center in the Redwoods, starting at 2 on Saturday. And you can find me on Twitter at Steve Kettmann, at Steve Kettmann. If anyone has questions and wants to reach out, feel free. But one thing about Pedro that I want to talk about is it's easy to praise a guy that's gone, but one thing I wonder about is, two of the essays in the book I like to mention are from managers who went from managing in the World Series, full glory of sport, to a really tough spot. Ron Washington had cocaine stuff come out. John Heyman reported on it. And of course, AJ Hinch had the sign stealing scandal break. And both of them at that time got calls from Pedro, took the calls, and they knew what was going on. If they were going to do an interview, they'd seriously consider doing it with Pedro. So he was doing a job, but he wasn't calling like a guy doing a job. He was calling like a friend who would be there. And, those two essays, I look back on them again and again. I find them pretty amazing, the amount of just humanity in them, because they both talked about Pedro giving them advice. And it wasn't easy advice. It was kind of tough advice, kind of tough love advice. But I would love to hear from each of you on not only how amazing and unusual that is, but it's not something every reporter could do. Every journalist could not also be a friend to people that they cover. It's a line that some feel they can't cross. I mean, I know, my own years as a beat guy and in various jobs, it can be a little confusing, but again, it was an area where Pedro made it all work and was a consummate professional. So I would love to hear from you on that. The book is partly about the idea of emulating Pedro and a code that he and I live by called KGB, which when I spoke after he died, along with the family in Arizona at the stadium there, I talked about the Gomez rules. And that's there in my intro. And that's what Brad and I named the website, thegomezrules.com. So I encourage everyone to go there. But it's always hard. It's like that thing, don't try this at home. It's like there's certain things about Pedro being Pedro that can be emulated, but I'm not sure all of it could be. I'm not sure everyone could handle that dance. And I'd love to hear from each of you on that, on being friends with people that you cover.
I hate them all. No, I'm kidding. You guys go ahead first if you want. I mean, the thing about Pedro is that, and Tim Kirkson told me this when I was writing his obit, was that he never shied away from the tough question. He always wanted to go into the losers clubhouse and talk to the guy who had just given up, a grand slam. Yeah, huh?
Rod Beck.
Rod Beck, exactly. But he was good at that, and he didn't shy away from that. And I will always admire that and think of that when I go into locker rooms.
Yeah.
Well, it's a really tough one. I'm sorry, Brian.
No, I want you to go because you're more on the beat than I am.
There are people you're closer with than others. And yet there are times you got to do what you got to do. And I've blown up relationships. I'm not going to go into specific stories, but it's really painful. It's the hardest thing about the job to me by far. But at the same time, the job is the job. Now, Steve put it really well. It's an extremely delicate dance. And for Pedro to pull it off the way he did, that is very rare. I don't know that I can. I don't know that I want to even, because it's very difficult when you get close to a person to report on them the way they need to be reported. And again, it makes me so uncomfortable, but it has to be done. So those relationships that he maintained with people like Ron Washington and AJ Hinch, it's amazing. And the best part about it is that AJ will tell you and Ron will tell you that it wasn't that Pedro was soft or not as professional as he should have been. Quite the contrary. He was extremely professional. He was doing his job, but at the same time, he was still in that role where he was more than an acquaintance with these guys. And again, it's just one of his many qualities that few of us, if any, really share.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say, beautifully said by both of you there, and it's fair to say, Steve, isn't it, that I mean, there's not an essay in here by Kurt Schilling or Barry Bonds, right?
Well, but I do have to mention here that I was pretty stunned when I drove down to Arizona and visited Sandy and the family just after Pedro died in February. I was the guy, everyone's at a party or gathering, they're all together, and there's the one person kind of standing alone over by the flowers, just kind of by himself. Because I was just standing there staring at the flowers that Barry Bonds had sent to the house. And as I told someone, if you know Barry, we all know Barry, he doesn't have a bunch of handlers who do stuff like that for him. He's not a teamwork kind of guy in that way. So if those flowers were there, Barry did that. Barry sent those flowers. And, Scott Boras has an essay in the collection, and so does Dusty Baker, two people with plenty of insight into Barry. And they both talked about how much respect there always was in that relationship. It's actually a pretty good example because we're talking about friends who then also respect you, but the guy who by all intents and purposes seems to hate you, but he also respects you. And
I say one thing about the Schilling thing, because to me, and it's in the book and TJ writes about it, it's the most impressive thing, I think, for me that Pedro did.
Yes.
And I know that covering the local team is much harder than doing it from a national perspective. Like I can rip guys now, but I'm not there the next day.
Yeah.
In most cases, sometimes, yes, it'll accidentally happen that way. But that middle of the World Series, end of the World Series. Game seven.
Yeah.
To say what this guy was in reality, in Pedro's view. I worked in Baltimore for many years and I was critical of Ripken at times. And the heat that comes back in that kind of situation is unbelievable.
Yeah.
The Orioles were never in the World Series when I was criticizing Cal Ripken. They went far in the playoffs, but never like that. And it was Pedro did it because that's what he was going to do. And he saw it this way and he knew what had happened earlier in the series. And that was that. And again, I don't know that there was any moment in his career, even the Bond stuff, when he dealt with that every day. The Schilling column was just, for me, the apex. It was awesome.
And
the thing about that Schilling column, it's important to remember, is, he had a certain grudging respect for Schilling. I mean, he was doing the job. But when Schilling tried to give himself an out, this was a theme with Pedro a lot. When people would do this, where they'd sort of leak something to the media that isn't even true, but to give themselves an out, he hated that because he loved that aspect of sports that there's nowhere to hide. You go out there, you get it done, or you don't. And so it was his sources, which were unparalleled,
impeccable,
and telling him all these different people, telling him the same thing about what had actually happened. And it's kind of a funny story because I was there. I was at his house and he came home. And in those years, he still called me coach. So he's like, Coach, you got to read my column for tomorrow. And so I came over in his kitchen there, read the column, and I was not at all sold that you do this the morning of Game 7, and in my intro, the part of my intro I read earlier when Ken wasn't yet on, I mentioned our mentor, Ed Badix, who was not so much a sport journalist as a man of the world. He was in Vietnam, philosophy major, incredible guy. But Badix would have been against that, for example. And Sandy Gomez was against it. We were all against it or not sold. And Pedro was Pedro, and I remember it so well. It's like, it's just what he had to do. And then he walked out onto the field the next day. And then I'm drawing the blanks. TJ wrote about it in his, but a player came over and shook his hand for all to see. And if I ever get to do a movie version of Pedro's life,
that would be the moment.
I got to get that moment. Sure.
No, it was one of the many things he taught me that, hey, you got to show your face. You got to show your face the next day. That's imperative. Don't write it unless you're going to show your face the next day.
One of the Gomez rules.
And that was before the Game 7 column. It was 99. So, perfect way to end it, right? Because he remembered who he was, right?
But why don't we just finish by each of you? I'll just give you, a few seconds or whatever, each of you to wrap up. Murph, you could tell the Carsey story. I mean, they'll let us go over just a little. It is
a funny story. Yeah,
but
just a fun one. So the Grotto. I don't know, Shelley, if you did many spring training. Yeah, you did. You did spring trainings, right? You did Cactus Leagues,
but never.
Well, you guys know the Grotto. It's no longer.
I know the Grotto. Yeah.
Grotto and the crazy owner Gary, right?
Yes.
And so we frequently the centrifugal force of the Grotto. Everybody's there: umpires, coaches, writers, everything. So we're having it's Michael Zagaris's birthday party, and it's a great crew from Bruce Jenkins to Z-Man to myself and my partner Paulie Mack and all sorts of people. And then here comes Pedro brought a guy who I didn't know. I didn't know who the guy was. And we were sitting there in the food, drink, and I don't know how we got on this. We started talking about the greatest choke jobs we've ever seen in sports. I don't know how to tie. That's the greatest choke. This is the greatest choke job. No, that's the greatest choke job. I said, there's no question. I said, nothing will ever top the New York Yankees the 2004 New York Yankees blowing a 3-0 lead to the Red Sox is beyond cinematic. It's intergalactic. It's impossible. It's the biggest choke job in the history, the 120 years of history and everything that went into it and the way it happened. And Gomez is like, Murph, you should probably get off that topic. I'm like, what do you mean get off that topic? It's the biggest trope of all time. I said, Pedro, I started getting heated. I'm like, you don't have a better one than that, Pedro. You can't find a worse one than that. They're the biggest chokers in the history of the world. And he puts his arm around Carsey. He goes, Murph, have you met Steve Carsey of the 2004 New York Yankees? It was just, he loved that story and might have brought it up to me every week for the next 20 years. He might have just called me out of nowhere, just going, Carsey! Just so we had a lot of laughs.
That's awesome. Awesome.
Shelley,
Just end with this.
I will never top that, so I'm not even going to try. So
Yeah, I don't have I can't top that either.
No,
I will share this.
Let's just end on that note because that's an incredible story.
He's up in heaven right now yelling Carsey at me right now.
Yeah.
Carsey, Murphy, Carsey.
That's awesome.
It's great.
That's awesome.
Here, there are 185 pictures in the book, and there's actually, I think, a picture of cars from that night, which I wasn't able to find. But here's Gary and Brad Mangin at the Grotto, which kind of gives people an idea of the vibe.
Well, I think in Bruce Jenkins's, by the way, just to top it off, to make it even more cinematic, Pedro was wearing a Cuba national baseball jersey that night.
Exactly.
He was wearing the red, white, and blue that night.
And speaking of Barry, here's Barry, a couple of Barry shots.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. I think in Jenkins' column, there's a picture of that night, and Pedro's in the jersey.
Well, that'd be a good reason for people to buy the book, right? Just to be able to see that picture.
Well, they should.
You did a great job. I'm going to say it again, and I'm going to continue to help promote it as much as I can. I know you guys all will too.
Yes. Great to see you, Ken and Shelley.
Yes, likewise. Likewise. I wish we saw each other more.
Yes, thank you guys. This was great.
It was great. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, and thanks very much to Book Passage and to Nick.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you. There I am on the screen. Thanks everybody for coming out. That was really wonderful to our speakers today. I really enjoyed that. Even with a little bit of technical difficulties around there, or well, not technical, people showing up when they can. I'm glad everybody managed to get in and actually make it. Thank you one last time to the audience for coming in. I'm glad everybody that made it out to actually watch. The book is Remember Who You Are. Make sure you can go and buy it by clicking the link in the description below or by following the link that we have pinned in the chat. I really appreciate all of you for coming out tonight. Make sure that you go and support your local independent bookstore, or you can order it from us on the website. We'll ship it to you just like any other online book retailer. And make sure, if you have the opportunity, you make it to the next book, the next event for this book that Steve brought up. One more time, what was the event that you have coming up next?
This Saturday at the Wellstone Center in Soquel, next to Santa Cruz. So it's a drive. But at 2:00 on Saturday, we'll be having a gathering for the event with a lot of the contributors. Would love to see some of you out there.
If you can make it, everybody, you absolutely should. You'll never, ever, ever regret a drive to Santa Cruz at the very, very least. Thank you one last time for coming out. I really appreciate everybody that made it here. I do truthfully hope to see you in the next one. Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.